Sir, I'm going to have to ask you what that is. The voice was young. It was sharp. It was filled with the kind of manufactured authority that comes from a crisp uniform and an unlined face. Corporal Decker stood over the old man, arms crossed, posture perfect, a living statue of regulations. The old man didn't look up. His eyes remained fixed on the middle distance, seeing something other than the polished wood of the military courtroom. His name was Silas Kane, though few in that room knew it, and fewer still would have cared. He was just an old man in a worn tweed jacket, a wrinkle in the day's otherwise smooth proceedings. In his lap, his hands cupped a small object. It was a bird, carved from a single piece of pale wood. It was smooth with age, its features softened by the touch of 1,000 anxious moments. It had no fine details, no painted eyes or etched feathers. It was the mere suggestion of a bird, a sparrow perhaps, caught in a moment of stillness before flight. Sir, Decker repeated, his voice a little louder this time, edged with impatience. Courtroom rules. Article 11b. No personal effects that could be considered a distraction. I need you to put that away. Silas Kane slowly blinked. His gaze drifted down from the wall, past the stern-faced judge on the dais, past the shuffling lawyers, and finally settled on the gleaming black boots of the bailiff before him. He did not look at the boy's face. It's not a distraction, Silas said. His voice was like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Quiet. Raspy. Decker shifted his weight, the leather of his duty belt creaking in protest. He was used to compliance. He was used to the snap-to-attention fear or respect that his uniform commanded. This quiet, immovable stillness from the old man was an affront. That's not for you to decide, Decker said, leaning in closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial hiss meant to convey dominance. What's in there, Grandpa? A magic wand. Put it in your pocket, or I'm confiscating it. The word hung in the air. Grandpa. It was a dismissal, a reduction of a man's entire life to a single, frail caricature. Across the room, sitting at another bailiff's table, Sergeant Reyes watched the exchange. He was a man whose face was a roadmap of 2 decades in the service. He saw things Decker did not. He saw the way the old man sat, not slumped with age, but rooted with patience. It was the stillness of a mountain, not a chair. Reyes had seen that stillness before, in grizzled masters-at-arms on the decks of destroyers, in old pilots sitting in the shade of a hangar, their eyes seeing ghost-filled skies. It was a stillness that had been paid for in blood and terror, a calm purchased at an unspeakable price. Decker, however, saw only an obstinate old man wasting his time. Last chance, Decker said, his hand twitching towards the old man's lap. Silas finally lifted his head. His eyes were pale blue, washed out like an old photograph, but they held a depth that momentarily startled the young corporal. They did not hold fear. They did not hold anger. They held a profound and ancient weariness. The boy needs it, Silas whispered, more to himself than to Decker. What boy? Decker scoffed. There's no one here. Now give me the trinket. The judge, a lieutenant colonel with a perpetually annoyed expression, banged his gavel. The minor administrative hearing had concluded. Bailiff, clear the public gallery. We are in recess for 15 minutes. The noise of scraping chairs and muted conversations filled the room. For Decker, this was the perfect opportunity. Under the cover of the general dismissal, he could assert his authority without a full audience. All right, time's up, he said, his voice regaining its official bark. He reached down, his fingers aiming to pluck the wooden bird from the old man's grasp. He made contact. The instant his skin touched the worn wood and the wrinkled flesh beneath it, the world shifted for Silas Kane. The low hum of the courtroom's air conditioning vanished. It was replaced by the high, thin whistle of wind tearing through a rocky mountain pass. The polished floor beneath his feet became frozen mud and sharp scree. The smell of floor wax and old paper was blasted away by the acrid stench of cordite, blood, and ozone. He wasn't in a courtroom. He was back there. He was huddled behind a frozen boulder, the stock of his rifle cold enough to burn his cheek. Beside him, a young private, a kid named Henderson with a picture of his newborn son taped to his helmet, was bleeding out. The kid's breathing was a wet, ragged sound, a terrible counterpoint to the howling wind. Tell him, Henderson had gasped, his fingers fumbling inside his jacket. Tell my boy, Silas had taken the kid's hand. It was so cold. I'll tell him his father was a hero, Silas had promised, his own voice raw from screaming orders and breathing the thin, icy air. No, Henderson coughed, a spray of red misting in the air. Tell him. About the sparrows. In the field behind our house. Tell him. I'll see him there. Henderson's hand had gone limp. For 3 days and 3 nights, Silas held that pass alone. He fought with a cold, precise fury, becoming a ghost in the rocks, a whisper of death to the waves of enemies that tried to break through. And in the quiet moments between the chaos, with his knife and a piece of discarded crate wood, he had carved. He carved a small sparrow, a promise, a memorial, a tangible piece of a soul he had sworn to remember. Decker's grip tightened, pulling Silas back to the present. The corporal's face was now a mask of smug victory. He had the bird. See? That wasn't so hard, Decker said, holding the small carving up to the light as if it were a piece of cheap contraband. You probably 3D printed this in your garage. But Silas wasn't looking at him. He was looking at his own empty hands. A profound, hollow ache spread through his chest. The boy needs it. Sergeant Reyes stood up. His chair made a sharp, deliberate scrape against the floor. Every instinct in his body was screaming. This was wrong. This was a desecration. He saw Decker's smug grin. He saw the old man's face, which had gone impossibly pale, his expression one of deep, soul-crushing loss. And Reyes made a decision. He walked calmly to the side door, pulling his service phone from his pocket. He didn't know who to call, not really, but he knew he had to call someone. He scrolled through his contacts, his thumb hovering over the number for the base command office. It was a major breach of protocol. He was supposed to go through his direct superior, but his gut told him this was beyond his chain of command. He pressed the call button. A crisp, annoyed voice answered on the second ring. General Thorne's office. Aide speaking. This is Sergeant Reyes at the courthouse, Reyes said, keeping his voice low and steady. I apologize for the direct call, sir, but we have a situation. Is it a security threat, Sergeant? The aide asked, his tone dripping with impatience. The general was in a classified briefing. No, sir. Not exactly. Reyes fumbled for the words. How could he explain the violation he had just witnessed? It wasn't in any rule book. There's an old man here. A civilian. One of the junior bailiffs is disrespecting him. A heavy sigh came through the phone. Sergeant, with all due respect, I can't interrupt the general for a personality conflict with a bailiff. Handle it. The line was about to go dead. Reyes panicked. His name is Silas Kane, he said too loudly. He lowered his voice. Sir, his name is Silas Kane. The bailiff took something from him. A small, carved wooden bird. A sparrow. Silence. It was not a normal silence. It was a sudden, absolute void. The background noise of the aide's office, the faint typing, the shuffling papers, it all ceased. Reyes thought the call had dropped. Sergeant, the aide's voice returned, but it was a completely different voice. The annoyance was gone, replaced by a tone of cold, sharp, and terrifying urgency. Repeat that name. Kane. Silas Kane, Reyes confirmed, his own heart starting to pound. And the object? A wooden sparrow, sir. Very old. Reyes heard a muffled sound, the aide speaking away from the phone. He heard a door slam open. He heard another voice in the background, a deep, authoritative bark. What is it? The aide came back on the line, his voice shaking slightly. Sergeant Reyes, listen to me very carefully. You are to return to that courtroom, and you are to stand beside Mr. Kane. Do not let anyone touch him. Do not let anyone speak to him. And you will ensure that Corporal Decker does not leave your sight. Is that understood? Sir, yes, sir, but... That was not a request, Sergeant. That was a direct order from General Marcus Thorne. He is on his way. Estimated time of arrival is 4 minutes. Acknowledge. Acknowledged, Reyes breathed, a chill running down his spine. Code red. Confirm code red, the aide said, and the line went dead. Reyes turned, his face pale. He strode back into the courtroom with a purpose that made Decker, who was still admiring his prize, look up in surprise. Reyes walked past him, directly to the old man's side. He stood at a respectful parade rest, his eyes fixed forward. What's going on, Sarge? Decker asked, a little unnerved by Reyes's sudden formality. Stay where you are, Corporal, Reyes said, his voice flat and hard. Don't move. Before Decker could retort, a sound began to build from outside. A low rumble that quickly grew into the roar of powerful engines and the high-pitched squeal of abused tires on asphalt. 3 black, government-plated SUVs screeched to a halt in the fire lane directly in front of the courthouse, scattering a flock of pigeons. Doors were thrown open before the vehicles had even fully stopped. Men in dark suits and earpieces spilled out, forming a perimeter. From the lead vehicle emerged a man who seemed to carry his own atmosphere of command. General Marcus Thorne, commander of the entire Joint Base, for silver stars gleaming on the collar of his immaculate service uniform. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. He didn't run. He moved with a terrifying, ground-eating stride that was faster than any run. He stormed through the courthouse doors, his command staff jogging to keep up. The security guards at the entrance took one look at his face and the 4 stars on his shoulders and simply flattened themselves against the walls. The general didn't look at them. He didn't look at the stunned lawyers or the confused judge, who was just re-entering the room. His eyes, like chips of blue ice, scanned the courtroom and found their target. He ignored everyone. He walked a line as straight and true as a bullet's path, directly toward the small, frail old man in the tweed jacket. He stopped precisely 1 foot in front of Silas Kane. The entire courtroom held its breath. General Marcus Thorne, a man who advised presidents and commanded armies, a warrior who had stared down the worst of humanity and never flinched, snapped to the sharpest, most rigid position of attention of his entire life. His hand came up in a salute so crisp it seemed to cut the air. It was a gesture of profound, almost painful respect. His voice, when he spoke, boomed through the stunned silence, echoing off the high ceilings. It was not the voice of a general to a civilian. It was the voice of a soldier to a monument. "Mr. Kane," he thundered, his voice thick with an emotion no one in that room had ever heard from him before. "It is an honor, sir." Silas Kane slowly looked up, his pale eyes meeting the general's. A flicker of recognition. A small, sad smile touched his lips. "Marcus, you've gotten old." The general's iron composure seemed to crack for a second. His own eyes glistened. "Not as old as you, Silas. Never as old as you." He dropped his salute and turned to face the bewildered courtroom. His gaze swept over the judge, the lawyers, and finally settled on Corporal Decker, who was frozen in place, the small wooden bird still clutched in his hand. The general's eyes became glacial. "I'm sure you are all wondering what this is about," General Thorne began, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that carried more menace than any shout. "You're wondering why I've just violated about a dozen articles of my own protocol, bursting into a legal proceeding." He took a step towards the center of the room. "You see this man," he said, gesturing not with a dismissive wave, but with a respectful inclination of his head towards Silas. "You see a frail, old man. You see a relic, a nuisance, someone who doesn't understand your very important rules." His eyes locked onto Decker's. "You see a grandpa." Decker flinched as if he'd been struck. The blood drained from his face. "Let me tell you who I see," the general continued, his voice resonating with history. "I see the man they called the Ghost of the Valley. I see a 19-year-old kid who held off an entire enemy battalion at Kestrel Pass for 72 hours. Alone, so that my father's company could get their wounded out." A collective gasp went through the room. The judge sat down heavily in his chair. "He wasn't a soldier in the way you understand it," Thorne went on, his voice a low, reverent sermon. "He was something else. The kind of man they send in when armies fail. He refused every medal. He refused the commission. He refused the commendations. When it was over, he just disappeared. He asked for only one thing, that the records of his service be sealed. He wanted no glory. He wanted no fame. He only wanted peace." The general took another step, his eyes never leaving Decker. "And that object you're holding," he said, his voice now barely a whisper, yet more terrifying than any roar. "That insignificant trinket, that is the only medal he ever accepted. He carved it from the wood of a supply crate while his best friend, Private Henderson, died in his arms. It was a promise to that boy's son. A promise this man has kept for 50 years. He carries it not for himself, but for a fallen brother." General Thorne was now standing directly in front of the trembling corporal. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You stand there in a uniform that men like Silas Kane bled for. You wear the cloth of a nation he saved, and you have the unmitigated arrogance to enforce a petty rule at the expense of his dignity. You didn't just disrespect a senior citizen, Corporal. You desecrated a holy relic. You stood in the presence of living history and saw only an obstacle. He held out his hand. Give it to me. Decker's hand was shaking so badly he could barely open it. The small wooden bird dropped into the general's palm. Thorne turned, his entire demeanor softening as he approached Silas. He knelt, an act of deference that shocked the room more than anything that had come before. A four-star general, on one knee, before a quiet old man in a tweed jacket. He gently placed the wooden bird back into Silas's waiting hands. "I am sorry, Silas," the general said, his voice thick with shame. "I am so sorry for the ignorance of this generation. We have failed to teach them." Silas Kane looked down at the general, and then over at the pale, terrified face of Corporal Decker. He saw not a monster, but a child who had been taught rules, but not reverence. He placed a frail hand on the general's uniformed shoulder. "He's a young man, Marcus," Silas said, his quiet voice cutting through the tension. "He's learning. Don't break him. Teach him." General Thorne looked up, his eyes filled with a fierce admiration. He nodded slowly, then rose to his full height. He gave Decker one last, long, appraising look. "You are fortunate," Thorne said to him, his voice flat. "Mr. Kane has shown you a grace you have not earned. But as he said, you will be taught." He turned to Sergeant Reyes. "Sergeant, effective immediately, you are in charge of developing a new training module for all junior NCOs and officers on this base. It will focus on the undocumented history of this service, on the men whose stories are not in the official records. It will be mandatory, and it will be called the Kane Protocol." Reyes stood taller. "Yes, General." Months passed. The story of that day in the courtroom became a quiet legend on the base. Corporal Decker was not broken. He was, as promised, taught. He was the first to take the Kane Protocol, and he took it to heart. He spent hours in the base archives, reading faded after-action reports, learning the true meaning of the uniform he wore. One afternoon, he found Silas Kane sitting in a quiet corner of the base library, reading a book of poetry. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing around him. The carved sparrow sat on the table beside him. Decker approached slowly, his hands clasped nervously behind his back. He stood before the table, waiting. Silas eventually looked up, his pale blue eyes showing no malice, only a quiet curiosity. "Mr. Kane," Decker began, his voice cracking slightly. "Sir, I wanted to apologize. Sincerely. For my conduct that day. There is no excuse for my ignorance or my arrogance. I was wrong." He stood there, braced for a dismissal, a harsh word, anything. Silas Kane simply closed his book, marking his page with a finger. He looked at the young man, truly looked at him, and saw the profound change in his eyes. The hollow confidence was gone, replaced by a nascent humility. A small, genuine smile touched the old man's lips. He nodded his acceptance of the apology. "Sit down, son," he said, gesturing to the empty chair. Decker sat, perched on the edge of the seat like a nervous bird himself. "You were taught a lesson that day," Silas said, his voice as gentle as ever. "But it's not about me. It's not about what I did. That's all just smoke and dust." He picked up the wooden sparrow, turning it over in his gnarled fingers. "The heaviest things we carry," Silas said softly, his eyes looking far away again, back to a frozen past and a dying boy's promise, "are the ones no one else can see. Remember that. Remember to look for the weight in people's eyes, not the rank on their shoulders." The lesson was learned.